This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches this week, and this roller coaster ride of a season continues. Last week, Dan and I were on here talking about the Flyers going from a 4-7-0 record and the embarrassment of a 6-1 loss on home ice to the New York Islanders to a 6-game point streak and a 3-game winning streak. And then this week, 3 more games are now in the books, and the Flyers posted a 0-2-1 record. So here the Flyers sit after 20 games, the quarter pole of the season essentially, with a 9-9-2 record and 20 points in the standings. It's the exact same point total they had after 20 games last season. The record is not exact, but it's close enough. And the point of all this is that after 3 seasons of this with rebuilding and retooling hanging over the franchise, this really can't be acceptable at this point. It's a little impressive that the Flyers even have 20 points because they did have They had to have some sustained success to even achieve that. The 6-game point streak certainly helps you climb back into it a little bit and reach the 20-point mark at this point of the season because it wasn't heading that way after the first 11 games. But at the same time, this is supposed to be a year of progress and advancement, and expectations were held a little bit higher this year. And while, look, even wins in back-to-back games is going to make a huge difference in the standings right now, it's not going to make up for the other areas where there haven't been success or improvement that continues to drag this team down. Until Saturday, the power play was one area. They go 3 for 5 in that game and score 3 power play goals on their last 3 power play attempts. And we have to wait and see if that carries over into any of the games coming up. But that's certainly a step in the right direction after going on a 3 for 45 stretch. The penalty kill is an absolute atrocity. It's just abysmal at this point. And the goaltending situation remains a situation due to injuries, due to patience and development, due to continued patchwork. It's still a problem too. So are fundamentals to an extent. The starts have been getting progressively better. The last 3 games the Flyers have played, there have been no score after the first period. But at the same time, fundamentals still come into play. They've allowed the first goal in all 3 of those games, even if it was in the second period. And we'll go into all of these areas at some point throughout the show, but I wanted to just get a scope of the situation from you, Rob, as well, because this is a quarter of the season over, and yet this is where this team is at again. Same situation. It doesn't feel like anything's really different from last year, the year before that, or the year before that, and that's another year under Dave Haxtell where they're not carving out a path to the playoffs early in the year. They're forced to still make up groundwork. So where do your thoughts lie with this team after another week and another quarter of the season that was underwhelming at the start, to say the least?
Yeah, I mean, you look at how underwhelming it's been for the orange and black so far this season, and the last time we were speaking here, Kevin, I was going on my rant about how the time has come to fire Haxtell because they got to make a change, and then they went out west and actually came back with pretty decent results. It looked like that they were actually responding to him, and it's something where I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's it's been kind of blah for the Flyers. I mean, it still looks like they're still having, problems figuring out who they are out there on the ice every night. But I do think that one key thing that is just, been rough for the Flyers ever since the initial puck drop in October was just the fact that everybody's getting hurt. You have Brian Elliott and Michael Neuwirth who are hurt, which, I mean, no surprise there. Michael Neuwirth is your classic SpongeBob character with, glass bones and paper skin. And, he's just lying in agony right now until his heart attacks put him to sleep. And, it's something where, you know that was going to happen. You had Van Riemsdyk, which was a tough loss. You had McDonald go down, which was a tough loss. You had Ivan Provorov right now, who looks like he's definitely battling an injury of some sorts out there. He's not the same defenseman that we know that he's capable of being. It's something where, injuries really have taken their toll on the team. I mean, we haven't seen James Van Riemsdyk come back until, 2 games ago, and he finally scored his first goal of the season on Saturday against Tampa Bay. And that's something where, he really battled back, that the team's just not really at full strength. for the most part, and it's really taken its toll. And obviously, you also look at pretty much the easiest way I think you can score a goal in the NHL these days is if you just manage to catch the Flyers off guard and get them to take a penalty, because that penalty kill of theirs is just it's been atrocious. I mean, I have no idea. It's just that they look confused. It just looks like it's just a big cluster for them at that point. And I have no, I can't remember seeing a penalty kill like that before in my life. I mean, it's just it's rough out there, and you just know that there's no way for it to get better. It almost seems, unless you're able to find a way to really shake things up or move on from Ian LaPerriere or whatever you have to do.
No question about it. I mean, you kind of hit on the first point of topic I had in mind, and that's the penalty kill. It's time to get rid of Ian LaPerriere at this point. Look, the guy was a warrior on the ice, and I get that, and I understand why people like him as for the player he was. But the penalty kill has gotten progressively worse every year since Dave Haxtell took over. And Ian LaPerriere is the guy on the bench who's supposed to be the penalty kill guy. They're in last place in the league with a 68.6% success rate, which is pathetic in general. There are peewee teams that can kill penalties at a better rate than that. But I saw something earlier today that I think kind of summed it up too, because there was kind of a listing that showed the Flyers penalty kill rank and percentages, not only from the time that Ian LaPerriere took over as the penalty kill coach, if you will, but also before that, and how the Flyers kind of had they had a top 10 penalty kill in some of those years. If you go back to 2011, 12 and things like that, they were a much more threatening shorthanded team than they are now. And I don't know how you can't pin anything else in this on Ian LaPerriere. It's got to fall on the coaching to some extent, and look, the coaching topic is a really interesting one to me, because first of all, you brought up the point that 3 weeks ago we were both on here. We both said the same kind of thing. We both had the same message going in here, and we basically spent the better part of 50 minutes talking about why it was time for the team to make a change and potentially move on from Dave Haxtell. And the team did go out and save, the jobs were saved by winning 3 of 4 on a West Coast trip and then winning the first 2 games of a homestand. No question about it. At the same time, speaking of coaching in general, in less than a month, as a matter of fact, 17 days total here, 4 teams have cut ties with their current head coaches. We obviously last time we were on, and even last time we were on talking about this 3 weeks ago, and Dan and I talked about this last week too. We've obviously covered John Stevens being fired by the Los Angeles Kings and Joel Quenneville being fired by the Chicago Blackhawks. Within the last 24 hours upon us recording this episode, both Mike Yeo of the St. Louis Blues and Todd McClellan of the Edmonton Oilers are out as well. And ironically enough, the replacement in St. Louis, at least in the interim, is Craig Berube. The replacement in Edmonton is Ken Hitchcock, 2 former Flyer head coaches.
Yeah, I saw that St. Louis brought the chief back because he'd been familiar with the organization. He coached their AHL team, the Chicago Wolves, a couple of years back, and he joined the Blues as an assistant. But I saw that they brought Craig Berube back, and I just had a nice old belly laugh about that one. That was hilarious.
At the very least, St. Louis did make it sound like that's temporary. LA kind of, when John Stevens was fired and they named an interim head coach, at the very least, they kind of said that's interim for the rest of the season. We'll look into this after the year. And with Chicago, they instantly jumped to the head coach of the minor league team, and it kind of switched everything up. But it was like they had a successor in mind. Edmonton went out and kind of went for the big splash, and so yanked Ken Hitchcock out of supposed retirement, if you will, because he said he wasn't going to coach in the NHL again. But here he is, and he's coaching a game on Tuesday night, no less. But at least, the Blues didn't say Berube's going to be the head coach for the rest of the season. It's just an effective immediately move. The reason I bring this up in general, though, is because 3 weeks ago, like we said, you and I were on here, and we basically said a coaching change was starting to become necessary. They go on the road. They save their jobs, every one of them, because winning, even if it's temporary, is a cure-all. So last week, I pulled back a little bit and acknowledged that the jobs were safe for the time being, and maybe that they were starting to turn the corner on being a team that people thought they could be. But I also sat there at that night and said, you can't just look at the 5-0-1 record and eliminate the past and what you started to climb out of. You need to keep going here, because if you don't, it can get ugly fast. The Flyers have now lost 3 straight games since then. They've only gotten 1 point in the standings. They have 4 pretty tough games coming up here because, let's face it, every game this team will play this season within their division, within their conference, realistically, even outside of the conference, is a tough game. Things are that close between teams in the standings this year, to the point where there's not a single team that I can look at and say, oh, that should be an easier win. They're a team that should be out of it or is in a situation. Look, there are games that the Flyers should win based on the opponent and the situation that the opponent might be in. But if you're going to sit here and say the Flyers are going to beat a team because they're a lesser team, forget it. As far as I'm concerned, nothing really changed here. It just got delayed. I'm not going to sit here and say that Dave Haxtell's seat is engulfed in flames at the moment, but think about this for a minute. What happens if they lose to Buffalo or the Rangers or Toronto or lose all 3 in the upcoming weekend? When does enough become enough here? With the way that the Flyers played on Saturday in the first period and the way they found a way to rally in the third period, there's a way for this team to win the next 3 games. No question about it. You go out and play the way you played the first period against Tampa or the third period against Tampa, you can win against the Buffalo Sabres and the New York Rangers and the Toronto Maple Leafs. You can. Tampa came in. That was essentially the class of the Eastern Conference this year to this point in the season. And yeah, sure, it got out of hand midway through the third period, but that first period was highly competitive and you outplayed them essentially. And then by the end of the third period, you had them on the ropes. So for a collective game, the second period was not very good. And the first part of the third period really was marred by the 2 power play goals scored in rapid succession. That's where that came in. And that's a penalty killing issue more than anything, because bottom line is if you take away 1 or 2 of those goals that were allowed while shorthanded, you probably end up winning the game against Tampa. That's the difference between an extra point. All of that being said, there's a way for them to win these 3 games. There's also a way for them to lose all 3. And the last thing you can do at this point is go on an extended losing streak like you did last season. At this time last year, the Flyers were mired in a 10-game losing streak that went from November 11th to December 2nd. The Flyers last won a game this season on November 10th. That's only 10 days and 3 games ago so far, but how quickly could it become 20 days and 6 or 7 games? You can't have that happen and not have to do some serious evaluation, self-evaluation for sure, and make some significant changes. I think that's, a big part of this. And part of this is that I sit here and I also wonder, how much longer are you going to stand by Dave Haxtell and insist that this is the guy when other names are out there? And if that adds any pressure to the situation. Because right now, as we're sitting here talking about it, Joel Quenneville and Todd McLellan are coaching free agents. You can also throw in Mike Yeo and John Stevens as well, though I don't think that the Flyers would go that way if they had their choice, if they had to make this decision tomorrow, let's say. But the point is that they're all out there right now. Quenneville and McLellan and Yeo and Stevens will not be out there forever. So if a change is going to be made with your coaching staff, or more specifically your head coach, it's either going to happen soon or not at all. And look, it's not like the Flyers are off to that much better of a start than the 2 teams that made coaching changes on Monday, or throughout the season for that matter. The Kings were 3-8-1 when they decided to fire John Stevens, and a win the night before they actually made that decision, or finalized it, if you will. It wasn't going to change their minds. When Chicago fired Joel Quenneville, they were 6-6-3. Mike Yeo gets fired by the Blues after a 7-9-3 record. Todd McLellan gets fired by the Oilers after a 9-10-1 record. The Flyers are 9-9-2. If a team in Edmonton or St. Louis feels that with 17 points or 19 points, a move must be made because their playoff lives are riding on this, and this is what they need to do in order to turn it around, then the Flyers at 20 points have to consider this. You're currently tied for 22nd in the league standings. And this has been the catch for years here. If the Flyers get on a run and gain 5 points, then they're in the top 10 in the league standings. But it's also just 5 points to the bottom. And that's what separates the Flyers from being the last place team in the league. So a 3 or 4 game streak, either way, it can lift your season back to being what everybody wanted it to be a top 3 in the Metropolitan Division kind of thing, challenging for that division lead perhaps, or it could completely destroy your season. That's how big these next 3 games could be right here.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I want to say that maybe I did overreact with that with my tangent a couple weeks ago on firing Dave Haxtell, but as soon as I saw that that Joel Quenneville was on the market, I was wondering why they didn't fire Dave Haxtell yesterday and bring in Joel Q. You know, I've always been a Joel Q guy. That's why it was kind of hard for me back when Chicago won in 2010 when they beat the Flyers, because it's like, yeah, you hate to see them lose, but Quenneville's a guy that you don't mind seeing win, and obviously, I mean, I was surprised that John Stevens got such a short leash out in L.A. Although I've always been big on Willie Desjardins, I think he's somebody who can you give him something to work with and he can get results. But as with Mike Yeo, I mean, I like Mike Yeo as well. He's not exactly the jazziest guy out there, and I think that the issue in St. Louis is that they had such a significant roster turnover, coming into this season, because they barely missed the playoffs last year, and they it's something where they decided to completely retool the roster, and it's one of those things that was just taking a little bit of time for them to gel, and it seems like something that's more or less an impatient kind of deal. And with regards to Todd McClellan, I mean, obviously, the Oilers, they have bar none the best player in the universe right now in Connor McDavid, and they still missed the playoffs last year. And I think that a lot of the moves that have been made, these coaching fires, were made not necessarily because of records and where they're standing right now. I think it's just because it's something where teams aren't exactly seeing them having a chance to get any better and make any kind of tangible improvement. I think it was Ken Holland from the Detroit Red Wings years ago had said that the best kind of buffer to see where a team can end up in the playoffs, for the most part, is where they're at in the standings on American Thanksgiving. And that's something where these teams are pulling the trigger, because obviously Thanksgiving's just a couple days away at this point, and that's something where teams are they're pulling the trigger, they're getting ready, because it's through 20 games, you it's not that you don't have a sense, because obviously you can just get real cold, you can go into lose several games, or you can get hot at any point. You can get really start to heat up once you get to February, March, April, and sneak into the playoffs and see where that takes you. So it's one of those things where I mean, Todd McClellan had been on the hot seat since the Oilers missed the playoffs last year. Because when you have the best player in the known observable universe right now, you got to get into the playoffs. You got to give him a chance to show off what he can do. And I mean, it's something where I think that what we saw in Los Angeles, what we saw in St. Louis, were more or less panic moves. But it's something where you know with Joel Quenville, I mean, it's an issue where Joel Q isn't the problem there. It's Stan Bowman's problem, and it's something where Quenville just became the fall guy, and it's something where like, yeah, record wise, these teams aren't exactly doing ideal. They're not doing what they're expected to do, but it just becomes something where there's situations that are still kind of unique, maybe in the eyes of, their expectations that were set forth at the beginning of the season. They're supposed to do much better than they're currently doing, and you just kind of have, ownership and general managers just, being harebrained and pulling the trigger quickly.
There was a great point I saw, and I can't remember where I saw it today, so you'll have to forgive me on that. But there was an article out about how basically every situation so far among the 4 coaching changes that have made this season has been different, but they fall under one common thread here, which is that it's not living up to expectations. That kind of struck me, because I struggle to figure out what's so different about that when talking about the Flyers right now. What's so different about that, where the Flyers aren't living up to some expectations that were set? They were supposed to go out and be better. 20 points in 20 games, which is the same mark that you had last year, isn't getting better. And, you know, sometimes we've seen this with a couple of these coaching decisions too. When when St. Louis is firing Mike Yeo and the first response out of anything is he's paying for the sins of the rest of the organization, or Todd McClellan's being, shipped out because Pete Chiarelli knows that this is pretty much the last shot he's got to turn Edmonton into something pretty big and get back to where they were roughly, 2 years ago when they were in the playoffs. And they were making a little bit of a run through the semifinals there of the Western Conference. And they've got to get back to that. And he knows it. And it's kind of these are desperation moves here. I don't know, for Chicago, I think that Chicago's decision to fire Joel Quenneville did not seem as much like we're not going where we want to go anymore. I think it was like it was an end of an era kind of move. For the city of Philadelphia, it harkens to the same feel as when Charlie Manuel was let go by the Phillies. At some point in time, you realize that the magic has worn off there, and it's not going to change anything. And it can be as a result of the mess from the rest of the organization in one way or the other. But it's also a way of saying, well, look, this guy isn't the whole reason that you win. He's a great head coach, no question about it, and he's got 3 Stanley Cup rings, to his name as part of Chicago, and that certainly comes into play. But that's not the same team anymore, and they're not getting any younger, and they're not the same players, and that makes a difference.
Yeah, and obviously, yeah, they did have an aging core, and obviously, when you have guys like Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane and Duncan Keith and Brent Seabrook getting older, that's not exactly the worst problem to have. But you look at their cap situation and the max contracts that Stan Bowman had signed them to. It's something where it comes down to the fact that when you're tying your so much of your cap into just bringing these guys in and locking those guys up kind of out of a loyalty deal. Obviously that's not something that Quenneville had input on, and I did think that absolutely blew my mind, because here's a guy who snapped a 49-year uh, Stanley Cup-less streak. They hadn't won in nearly half a century, and they not only did they just win one cup, they went and won 2 more after that. And it's something where it would be like if the Eagles decided to fire Doug Peterson after he helped them win their first ever Super Bowl. It's just one of those things that you can't fathom how that goes. It was astonishing as far as I'm concerned. It blew my mind, but obviously every once in a while you need a new voice, and it's something where Stan Bowman kind of felt like that was the best way to go about things. Maybe get those guys a new voice, and maybe try to get them to newer heights.
Well, Dan and I talked about the game Chicago played in Philadelphia last week, and that look, new coach or not, that's a team that looks like they're down and out for the count right now. Just the way, I mean, they've had some solid games since then, but early on when the coaching change was made, they looked deflated and defeated. Especially Jonathan Toews. I noticed that Jonathan Toews really kind of had that frustration factor setting in, and I said this last week with Dan. They call him Captain Serious for a reason, because he does take the game very seriously, but the frustration level that you could see that was actually visible was very surprising for a guy who's essentially, with the way that he plays, not in the same way that Patrick Kane plays, where Patrick Kane's a big goal scorer. Taves has got a lot of good numbers, but Taves is the guy who could put that team on his shoulders and carry them to the finish line, especially in those years where they did go all the way and win the Stanley Cup 3 times over. So it's a kind of how the mighty have fallen kind of situation. You could say the same with LA in a way too. I mean, LA was not that far removed from being at the top of the league also, and they're currently sitting in last place at the moment. But I mean, again, the margin's really close here. So, that's the only reason, look, maybe it's also a reflection of what we've seen in years past, beyond Dave Haxtell being named the head coach of this team and Ron Hextall being the GM of this team. I liken it to a situation, you get to that early December mark, and if there's a coach floating around out there, I can't help but think about when John Stevens was fired. That was early December, and Peter Laviolette's sitting out there, and there's a guy who was proven, won a Stanley Cup, and the goal was come in and do the same thing. Come in and help us win. And he took that year, he helped take him to a Stanley Cup final. and they had playoff success for 2 more years after that, not extreme playoff success, nothing on the like they did in 2010 where they were 2 games away from winning a Stanley Cup, but, you know, the point is that that's also the last time the Flyers made the playoffs and won a playoff series, and that certainly falls into consideration here. I think that the same you could look at Joel Quenneville being out there as the same kind of thing here. Here's a head coach who could be the voice that this team needs to hear to turn things around. Somebody who the veteran players would probably respond to a little bit better, I would think, and somebody who could probably get some things in gear here that haven't been working out lately. I also wanted to tie in, Rob, because this is something I was, sometimes you have those thoughts during the day where you go, random thoughts here. I don't know why this stuff pops in my head, but it does because I'm thinking about this. And obviously, Joel Quenneville has the Stanley Cup pedigree tied to his name with Chicago, obviously. At the same time, when Chicago fired Joel Quenneville, they also let go 2 assistant coaches. And interestingly enough, when you consider the 2 assistant coaches who I don't know if Quenneville started coaching again this season, I don't know that the assistant coaches would come with. I don't know that a team, at this point, it's hard to say the Flyers, if they did make a decision on the head coach, would actually part ways with the assistants too. It's tough to say. But if they were, and there was room for someone like Quenneville to bring in his own assistant coaches, especially ones he's had for recent years, here's a consideration for you. One of his assistants was Kevin Dineen, a former Flyer captain, played 4.5 seasons with the team, I believe, and was an assistant under Joel Quenneville for the better part of the last 4 seasons here. His other assistant, or one of his other assistants, was Ulf Samuelsson, who also played part of 1 season with the Flyers, was an assistant coach for the Rangers for 4 seasons, joined Chicago last season, had a brief head coaching stint in the minors, and by the way, his son, Philip Samuelsson, currently plays for the Lehigh Valley Phantoms. If you can't piece together how the 2 assistants have some form of connection to the Flyer organization here, one way or the other, could you imagine if that was the bench all of a sudden? I think that I just look at that and I go, the Flyer ties make it realistic. That's about all. That's the only thing I'll say about it. It makes it realistic. And it's the type of move that the Flyers would have made 5 or 10 years ago in an effort to try to turn a season around that wasn't going the way that they thought it should go. If it wasn't reaching the heights they thought it should reach by now, then they would try to speed it up. And that's where a move like firing John Stevens and hiring Peter Laviolette comes some 8 years ago. That's where that comes from. So maybe that's a possibility, but I'm not going to speculate on anything. I don't know that anything's going to happen. If it didn't, to me, I feel like something would have happened already after 4 and 7 than to wait this long. But early December is a time when stuff happens. It's not uncommon for the Flyers to kind of make these decisions either just past the quarter point of the season. And like you mentioned, Rob, American Thanksgiving is really one of the big markers for determining whether or not you're going to be in the picture or not. And it's interesting because when I was on with Dan last week, we talked about how at that time with the Flyers on a 6-game point streak, they were challenging for the top 3, potentially even the top 2 of the division. And the goal there was if you can comfortably slide into the playoff picture, or not comfortably, but at least if you can be in the top 3 at that quarter point at Thanksgiving, then you're doing something right at that point. Maybe the 4 and 7 start wasn't great, but you had turned the season around. At that point in time, the Flyers were 9, 7 and 1, and you're going, at least it's better with the way that the things have gone lately. It's way better than what they started off at. 5-0 and 1 in the last 6 is certainly good, but to see it fall back to a 500 record, essentially, at 9-9 and 2, and to be 5 points shy of a wild card because the Atlantic Division is doing that well this year, and 3 points out of a playoff spot if you go off of the Metro Division and who holds that 3rd spot. There's got to be a level where you can take this a little bit higher and make it better. And look, you pointed out the injuries early on. I think the injury to JVR was a big disappointment, and nothing that he could do, obviously. It's just a big disappointment because he was supposed to be one of your offensive catalysts here, a guy who could transform the way that the offense went, and you're finally just, that little taste that you got on Saturday against Tampa Bay, where he had a goal and 2 assists, is just probably just scratching the surface with him. But it was not, it's good to see him back out there and putting up points, because I think there was a point right before or even during parts of the 6-game winning streak, even, where it was, this team needs to get JVR back. They needed to get him back sooner or later. The thing with injuries, though, is that it's goaltending. It kind of comes down to goaltending all the time. And as soon as Brian Elliott gets hurt, it feels like the sky is falling, because you don't want to roll with Cal Pickard and Alex Lyon. You don't want to do that. And Michael Neuvert is where you had to expect he would be at some point this season, on IR. And it's not even the first time he's been on IR, it's the second. And Carter Hart is nowhere near ready to be in the NHL. So don't even let that thought cross your mind here. He's not ready, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise. He's just not. And Anthony Stolarz is working his way back into a rhythm in limited playing time in the minors. So he's not going to get the call either. There's nowhere for this team to turn when Brian Elliott goes down. And he's out for whatever's left of this 2-week injury, which is probably still about a week and a half, a week to a week and a half here, which means that you're going to have to survive the next week and a half of this injury timetable. And that's critical. I just mentioned earlier in the show about how the next 3 games, Buffalo, the Rangers, and Toronto, that's 3 and 4 days. And how much ground could you lose in the next 3 games? You could lose a lot. And then you got Ottawa coming in. And Ottawa technically has more points than the Flyers do right now. That could certainly change by the time the 2 teams meet in the final game in November. But, how much longer are you supposed to go with that? And then is the way you really want to greet Brian Elliott in his return from injury, potentially, with, oh, by the way, even, and I don't care what the records say or what the point totals say, is the way you want to greet him with, hey, by the way, here's the Pittsburgh Penguins for you. The team that lit you up in the playoffs last year. Is that the way you really want to greet the guy coming back from an injury? I don't think it is, but I also don't want to know what would happen if you put Cal Pickard or Alex Lyon in to face that team. That's the thing. I mean, Pittsburgh's not off to a great start this season. There certainly are a lot of questions surrounding that team, and they're trying to make changes. They're actively trying to make changes, and so far it's got them at the bottom of the Eastern Conference, which is a very...
Can they fire Mike Sullivan?
I don't know. I don't think...
I would find that hilarious if they did.
I would find it hilarious, too, because I don't think that that's the move that they would try to make. But at the same time, my thought with Pittsburgh is this. Look, we can sit here and talk about what happens when the crowd gets going in a Flyers-Penguins rivalry game and things like that. And obviously, the outdoor game is one of the highlights of the schedule coming up in February. Here's the bottom line. Pittsburgh gets on a 3-game winning streak, and they're out of the cellar. It's that simple, and that's not... Pittsburgh's got too good of a lineup, even for how long these players have played. Sidney Crosby's not a kid anymore. Sid the Kid is not a kid anymore, and Malkin's not a kid anymore, and Kessel's not.
Can you imagine if this skid just continues for them and they just stay in last place for the rest of the season, and they end up getting the number 1 pick in the draft lottery, and they get Jack Hughes?
The thought isn't lost on me. I'll say that much for you. But I also...
I just threw up in my mouth.
Yeah, well, I just can't see it happening because they're too good of a team to...
Oh, yeah. They can write the shit.
But at the same time, stranger things have happened, and in a season where, based on the way the standings are, one false move, one bad turnover could cost you a point or two, and losing points could just slip you to the cellar of the standings. I mean, think about it for a minute here. Do you think Washington feels safe at all in 3rd place in the Metro Division with 23 points, knowing Pittsburgh's sitting there in last place at 18? If the 2 teams played each other 3 more times, which of course these Metro teams play each other multiple times in a year, if they play 3 more times and Pittsburgh wins all 3, they've gained and made up the margin. That's how close things are, and that's why these games, not necessarily... Look, Buffalo and Toronto are good matchups for the Flyers, because Buffalo's been a surprising team this season. Not that they're in a playoff picture, but that they're in the top 3 of the Atlantic. I don't think anybody had that sized up at the beginning of the year. The fact that Boston right now is a team that everybody would have thought was a top 3 team in the Atlantic, and Buffalo and Montreal are both ahead of them. So, not that, and that can change very quickly too. But Buffalo is not a slouch team this year, and just look at what they did in their last game on Monday night. They go out, they're down 4-1 to Pittsburgh. They find a way to rally back, and they win in overtime. That's 2 more points in the standings, and they're 28 points. They're 2 points off of the best record not only in the in the definitely 2 points of the best record in the Eastern Conference and 3 points of the best record in the league, or most points in the league. That's insane for a team that a year ago was on the path, as everybody knew it, to Rasmus Dahlin. And now Dahlin's not even the best performing player on that team right now. He's having those rookie issues playing defense in the NHL because it's a different game as an 18-year-old. But Casey Middleset's having a good year. Jeff Skinner's having a great year. And Jack Eichel's being Jack Eichel. And those things factor in too. So you look at these games, Buffalo and Toronto aren't divisional games, but they're good games because you want to win in your conference. But that game against the Rangers on Friday is huge. These divisional games, you look at these divisional 4-point games, these games are huge. And you're going to have another one coming up with Pittsburgh down the road here. Columbus comes into town at one point in time. And there's enough of these games that are going to come up on the schedule that you have to, it was all well and good when the Flyers put together this point streak, but you consider the teams they were putting the point streak together against. And I'm not saying that they're teams that you don't want to beat, but they're not those critical games against the teams in your division. It was, let's go on the West Coast, Anaheim, LA, San Jose, Arizona twice, then Chicago. And then as soon as the schedule shifted back to the Eastern Conference, lost to Florida, lost to New Jersey, and lost to Tampa Bay. So suddenly it's the play within the Eastern Conference, and it does have, the shame of it was that Brian Elliott was starting to play really well leading up to that. He gets the shutout against Chicago. He had a partial shutout, if you will, because he had no margin for error in that game he entered against Arizona in relief, and he shut the door there. He played a really good game against Florida, let in one goal I think he wanted to have back, and unfortunately, that was the game-winning goal, and the Flyers were buzzing that whole time. They just couldn't beat Roberto Luongo. Then you go to the New Jersey game, and again, he was holding them in that New Jersey game. It's 1-0 going late into the third period, and that second goal just ultimately forces him to do too much, and he's barely able to move, and it's an injury. It's all these different little problems that come up, and they're the same problems, and at the same time, we're sitting here talking about these crucial games, and these aren't easy games. It's not like there's not a game where you can sit there and go, they have the potential to play down to the opponent, because they're either going to get bested by a team that's probably better than they are right now, or they're going to stand up to the competition and actually make it a competitive game. All right, so let's talk power play for a second, because that's an issue I don't think we were as prepared to talk about this season. It's not something where you expect to see this group go 3 for 45 at a point in time during the season, and it shouldn't happen with the personnel that the Flyers have. But they do go 3 for 3 in their final 3 attempts on Saturday, and that's a step in the right direction. We've already talked about the addition of JVR coming back from injury and how he looks comfortable at net front. He did get his first goal on the power play. And look, maybe getting one or having one of those good games like that does the trick here, but we'll have to see the upcoming games to know this. But that's certainly a start. And Rob, I kind of want your take on what you've seen from the power play. Is it just pressing too much and trying to make too much happen? And now that they've had a game where it finally started to go their way, maybe that can settle them into more of a rhythm?
Yeah, I mean the power play is always one of those funny things because it looks like one of those things that it clicks on all cylinders. It looks like that they're able to move the puck at will, and sure enough they're not able to cash in, and then sometimes you don't expect them to do anything, and then they're able to cash in. It's always going to be up, and it's always going to be down. It's always going to freeze up a little bit, and then you get that one goal, and then sure enough. Like once it starts to mount a little bit, you start, squeezing the stick a little too much. You're not able to find the net as well, and then sure enough, you are able to score, and then that's just kind of that kind of takes the pressure off you a little bit, and you're able to just build off of that and capitalize and keep scoring on power plays. I mean, it's one of those things that nobody's immune to it. I mean, it's you always hate to see it happen, but there it's one of those things where obviously as you mentioned, they get those 3 late goals. A very spirited comeback against Tampa Bay, which is something that had thoroughly impressed me, and it's something that I mean, obviously they didn't get the 2 points that they wanted in the end, but there's still a lot that they can do to build off of that, and really kind of keep climbing forward. So it's one of those things that I think it's really more or less just a sign to be optimistic about, and something that you can you can kind of hang your hat on on a positive note, and I'm curious to see how they build off of that.
Yeah, I mean, Look, the power play is going to have success at some point this season. You want to see it on a much more sustained level, and I think it's also the disparity between the power play struggles at the same time with the penalty kill struggles. It just makes special teams a total disaster. The Flyers, I don't think, have been a bad team at 5-on-5 this season at all. I think they've actually done a really good job of generating a lot of scoring chances and being an effective team at 5-on-5. But as soon as you let the game kind of get to that stage, you know, aside from the game against Chicago, which obviously was a shutout win, there hasn't been a game that's gone by for the last month or plus at this point without them allowing a power play goal. I mean, if the opposing team gets a power play, the odds at this point are almost 50-50 that it's going in the net. And that's a percentage you can't play with. And to see them not do anything about it, I mean, it wasn't just a, hey, they didn't do anything about it in the offseason kind of thing, and that, where it falls into Ron Hextall's plate. It's also just like we said at the beginning. I think this is a coaching issue too. You got to play aggressive on a penalty kill. You want to be aggressive. You want to be aggressive, but you also want to be responsible enough and smart enough to not put yourself in a bad situation. There are times where the Flyers are getting beat by a situation where, you know, they've done a lot of things right in the first half of a penalty kill, but the second half something falls apart somehow. But for the Flyers power play specifically, I think the pressure mounted because of the way the penalty kill was. If you know that the penalty kill is going to be a problem in a game, which it sure seems that way for right now, then you're going to try even harder on the power play to make up the margin. The thing about the power play that's kind of gotten to me over the whole course of the season is that I look at games, and look, some of them aren't great examples here, but I do look at games, like the Florida game, for example, where they lost 2-1. They only had one power play in that game. So it's really, really hard. And it was in the first period too, by the way. So it's really hard to look at a spot in the game where you went, the power play needed the goal there, or got the opportunity to tie the game or win the game potentially with a power play goal. And it just didn't, and they couldn't put it together. The New Jersey game was a different story. They go 0 for 4 that night. And not only do they go 0 for 4, but you had two chances in the first period to tie the game after allowing the first goal. That's the first part. You let those two go by the wayside. You got one in the second period and one early in the third period that should be the opportunity to tie that game back up. And you're missing out on the opportunity to get back in that game and potentially see where it goes in terms of getting a point out of it. They had this, you could say the same thing happened in the game against Boston. That's a game where, again, the Flyers come out, they play a really good first period, they play a decent second period to a point, and what happens? As soon as, you get a couple chances, you get one late in the first period on the power play, and as soon as the Flyers took a penalty in the second period that allowed Boston to get to their second power play, there's a goal scored. And even after that, down 2-0, you got a power play early in the third, and then you got another one right after, and you still couldn't score. It's a problem area. It's a really big problem area at that point. And there's enough games that I can remember watching at this point where they'll go 0 for 2, 0 for 3, 0 for 4, and miss out on the opportunity to climb their way back into a game where if you're down by 2 goals, or if you're down by a goal, or if it's a tie game, that could have been the spot to win the game and get a point or 2 points. That could be the difference. And it's got to get better in that regard. And I think, look, on Saturday, it clearly was one of the keys to earning the Flyers a point in the standings. No question about it. But it's got to be more consistent, and it's got to be back to a rate where they're achieving enough success to make up for some of the penalty kills losses. The penalty kill, even if it does take steps to improve, isn't going to suddenly improve to an 80% penalty kill efficiency overnight. It's going to take them probably the rest of the season killing penalties at a good 85 to 90% rate to just average out at 80% because they've fallen that far into a hole. But the power play can make up for some of the goals that are allowed. If you can, you can sometimes get away with a game where an opposing team goes 1 for 4 on the power play. If you go 1 for 3 or 2 for 4, or have a game like that where you make up for it, or you get the goal back and outplay them at even strength the rest of the way. That's not happening enough, where they're outplaying teams sometimes at even strength, and special teams, they are absolutely getting killed. And it has the potential to wreck their season. So that's that's something to keep in mind there. I wanted to go back as we start to get into the kind of the tail end of the show here for this week. I wanted to go back and touch back on the upcoming schedule again because, as mentioned earlier, it's a tough stretch of 4 games they're going to have coming up between the next 3: Buffalo, the Rangers, Toronto, and then Ottawa's lurking as they end the month of November. Look, Buffalo, like I said, has been a very surprisingly good team this year, in the top 3 in the Atlantic, challenging for the Atlantic Division lead in ways. And look, you have to play them. You have to take them seriously here. This isn't the Buffalo team where, and the Flyers don't play Buffalo well on the road. They haven't even when Buffalo was at the bottom of the standings. But they have to play Buffalo with a lot more respect now than they did last year or the year before that or anything like that. The Rangers are a divisional opponent. That's tough no matter what. And let's not forget that the Rangers are currently sitting in the top 3 in the division in second place, but the margin is close. Like there's so much. The standings are so clogged right now, and there's so much that can happen in one night that could shift the way the standings look, that every game is important. And that Ranger game holds a lot of weight here, in terms of where the Flyers could start to see themselves positioned in the standings after that game. Toronto is probably, I'd still say Toronto is probably the second best team in the conference behind Tampa, but it's neck and neck, and they are holding the division lead right now. So you can't slight them for anything here, and Toronto's doing it also without Austin Matthews. So if you think you're catching a break because Austin Matthews is injured, think again, because between the way Mitch Marner's playing, Nazem Kadri stepped into that one of those center roles really well. He's been playing the second line, I believe. John Tavares is obviously a huge threat and has killed the Flyers over his career. And they've got enough depth that they're making up for it. And think about it. I mean, not only is that a team without Austin Matthews, but that's a team that, William Nylander is still a saga with that team. So they're missing 2 key players, essentially, and not missing a beat because of their new free agent acquisition, who's stepped in and obviously done a great job, as was to be expected. But it's the way that other players have stepped up. Marner, Marleau, Kadri, all these guys are filling roles. Kasperi Kapanen's having a great season so far. What a player he's turned out to be from one year to the next and things like that. And then, look, Ottawa's currently ahead of you in the standings. No matter how you want to look at that team and what that organization is going through, they still have more points than you do. This is not an easy schedule, and I'm going to ask you the same thing here, Rob, but I think the Flyers need to get points in at least 3 of the next 4 games to make this any kind of a success. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that, you look at it and, Buffalo is one of those teams that I always feel like consistently has been a thorn in the Flyers' side. It's one of those things that, when they had their lowly period, it's like you always felt like they can go up there and get a win, and Buffalo just finds a way to play so hard against them and come away with the victory. And it's one of those things. I saw that. Last night they were playing the Penguins, and they snapped a real long drought. The last time they beat Pittsburgh, it was April of 2013, which was something that blew my mind. So that's obviously something that they're going to be reeling fresh off of, and it's one of those things that like you can try to overlook the Sabres or the Rangers all you want, but that's just nothing good is going to happen if they try any of that. So it's something where. I just hope that Buffalo's not as much of a thorn in their side, and I'm curious to, because Casey Middlestad's a guy that I've had my eye on. He's somebody who's been, looking pretty decent as you touched on earlier, and somebody who, should be, a good enough player to watch, in the coming years. And obviously, if I'm hearing that Austin Matthews is back practicing for the Leafs, so I don't know if that means that he'll be set to go for Saturday, but that'll make the matchup. It's one of those things where it's a tough matchup regardless. But if you have him, I mean, it's almost game over at that point. He's one of those guys that's just been absolutely incredible to watch, and the fact that they're still able to stay in first place even without him is a true testament to how they are as a team, and how Mike Babcock's able to run a ship so efficiently. So it's one of those things that even the Rangers, I mean, they're having their fair share of younger guys. Guys like Brett Howden stepping up, Neil Pionk. I think they called Elias Anderson up a couple of weeks ago. So it's one of those things that they were expected to kind of have a tough rebuild, and they're kind of playing out of their minds so far. And I mean, obviously, they're going to come back to earth at some point. They have no chance to, but or they have no choice but to. But it's one of those things that this coming week. I mean, it's one of those things that almost looks like it could be a decent stretch for the Flyers, but nothing's guaranteed at any point. So it's one of those things that we'll see how they do, and I'm kind of curious as to how that comes along.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Buffalo's on a 6-game winning streak right now, so that should tell you how things are going for them. You mentioned the Rangers just being a team. The Rangers, this was supposed to be a throwaway year for the Rangers, if everybody remembers correctly, and they're in second place in the division, so you can't discount them anything. And could you imagine if Austin Matthews does make his return on Saturday against the Flyers? Could you just imagine that? I mean, after all that they've already put up with and dealt with to maintain the division lead without him, they get him back. I don't know if it's necessary. Look, the Flyers played Toronto extremely well last year in all 3 games that they had against that team. And at the same time, it will feel like almost game over because of the fact that Austin Matthews returning to the lineup for a home game, no less, it would send a complete jolt through that team. And it might look like an all-star team out there at that point. It could really get out of hand pretty quickly if the Flyers aren't on top of their game. And the Flyers will be fresh off of the Friday afternoon against the Rangers. So, and look, Toronto does have to make a trip back from Columbus, and that's, no easy game either. But, there's enough going on around the league that these teams are all going to play each other, and you have to catch a team on the right night sometimes. If the Flyers can do that with Buffalo, Buffalo. The thing about Buffalo right now is when you're on a 6-game winning streak and things are going so well, there's always the opportunity for something to slip up. And maybe you started to see signs of that against Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh really kind of took it to them for the first couple periods of that game, and then Buffalo trimmed the gap a little bit and slowly worked their way back in, tied the game in the third, won the game in overtime. And you wonder if you catch them in the right spot there, perhaps. But it's a really tough stretch of games coming up, and this could be a real big stretch for the Flyers because if you go into December and you have to play the Penguins on December 1st, and you've come off a stretch where you are still riding a little bit of a losing streak here, one of the big things about the Flyers losing recently, or not necessarily even recently, but some of these games they had earlier in the year that they could string together too. I had pointed out that on the 10-game losing streak they had a year ago, how many games did the Flyers have where they were getting ahead in games and not finishing the job? There's a difference between starting out slow and having to climb out of a hole and chase the game, and ultimately just leaving the door open for a team to come back on you. The Flyers played enough games last season during that 10-game stretch where that was the very case, where you could either look at it and say they scored the first goal in those games, or they had a lead maybe after the first period or the second period that felt significant enough that they should have found a way to finish the job. And I look, it's too tough to say that at the beginning. They gave up a third period goal in a 1-0 loss to Minnesota on November 11th last year. Then they gave up a first period. They have a goal 12 seconds into the game against Minnesota on the next loss. And that one goal held up for the entire game until 2 empty net goals at the very end. Game against Winnipeg, they took a 2-0 lead, gave up 1 in the second, 1 in the final minute of the third, lost in a shootout. Game against Calgary, this is the the fourth game of the losing streak. They took a 1-0 lead. They had a 3-1 lead after the first period, and by the end of the second period, the game was tied at 4. They lost in overtime. 5-4, by the way, against Vancouver, game 5 of this stretch. They scored the first goal, then gave up 2 more. And then at that point, Vancouver took control in the second period, scored 2 goals, made it 4-1. The game was virtually over right there. They played the Islanders on November 22nd. This is game 7 of the losing streak. Game 6 of the losing streak. And again, 1-0 lead earlier in the game. They come back to tie the game 3-3 after the second. They lost that game in overtime. I played the Islanders again in another game. They gave up the first goal in that game, but then scored 4 in the second period and opened up a 4-2 lead after 2 periods. They gave up 2 goals in the third, lost in overtime, 5-4. Pittsburgh, this was the 8th game of the losing streak. They gave up the first goal, scored 3 in the second, unanswered, to take a 3-1 lead to the third period. Gave up 2 goals in the first 2 minutes of the third period that tied the game. Got a go-ahead goal with under 4 minutes to play, still gave up the tying goal and lost in overtime, 5-4. San Jose was game number 9 of the losing streak. They scored the first goal less than a minute into the game, gave up 2 more by the end of the first period, and trailed the rest of the way. And then finally, game 10, which was a home game against Boston, they gave up the first goal in the first period, but never really found their way out of it, and they kind of lazed their way through the rest of that game. But the bottom line is, lead against Winnipeg, lead against Calgary, lead against the Islanders, lead against Pittsburgh. That's 4 games where they had a lead at critical stages of the game, whether it's in the second period, the third period, and you had a chance to snap it then. And in every single game, it got to overtime, understandably, but you need to finish those games off. That's the key point here. You need to finish these games. And for the Flyers now, I look at the recent stretch of games and I go, they've given up the first goal in the last 3. Only one of them was in the first period. Correction from me saying earlier that they went the last 3 games scoreless in the first period. They did give up the first goal early in the game against the Devils. But again, it was a scoreless or a nearly scoreless first period against Chicago. The Flyers scored the only goal of that one. Things like that. But you look at some of these games and you go, the game against Florida, they might have been chasing the game for most of it, but it wasn't like they were chasing it badly. It was mainly a 1-0 game. Same thing with the New Jersey game. These are 1-0 games where you're not chasing the game, and a 1-0 game is still a game. It's just you gave up the first goal. Was it different against Tampa Bay? Of course it wasn't. And look, that rally is fun. It's exciting. It's cool. You don't ever want to put yourself in that situation. And the only reason you're in that situation is because your penalty kill has been awful and you let things happen in rapid succession. It's little mistakes. The only goal I can remember from that Tampa Bay game that I can honestly sit there and tell you was on the goaltender himself, was Cedric Paquette's goal. That was the second goal of the game. It made it 2-0 midway through the second period. That's one I think that Pickard should have stopped, but you give up. The first goal was a power play goal. The third goal, which was also in the second period, Braden Point, who is much smaller than Ivan Provorov, just completely outmuscles his way to the front of the net, scores an easy goal. Can't happen. 2 goals on the power play that are scored 11 seconds apart from each other. Can't happen. You got to regroup after that first power play goal that makes it 4-1 and find a way to try to chip away again and get that second goal that makes it 4-2 with still maybe 10 minutes to go or 9.5 minutes to go. Not the other way around and give up another quick goal to just have it, come back again. And while they rallied great, and then even in overtime, it's 3-on-3 against the best team in the league to that point in the season, or best team in the conference to that point in the season. That was before Toronto pulled ahead in the division standings. But it's 3-on-3. They've got skilled guys, and Wayne Simmons loses his man behind the net, and that allows Anthony Cirelli to get to the front of the net and score the game-winning goal. You could have really turned things around in a big way if you found a way to win that game in overtime, because it would change the perception. It's more than just getting, a character rally. It's a character win if you do that. And that was not to be the case. So this upcoming stretch is where you've got to play solid hockey all the way around. You really got to try to find a way to get back to that situation and that style of play that you had against Chicago. You played a pretty damn near perfect game against Chicago, and you got to find a way to do that. So before we wrap things up, Rob, do you have any other final thoughts before we wrap?
Other than just wanted to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, and that's really all I got. Happy Thanksgiving to our audience and the rest of the Sports Talk Philly network. It's an absolute pleasure and something that I enjoy.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say we're thankful that we have the opportunity to do this and to still be able to watch these games and to be able to do this on a regular basis. And we're thankful for the people who do read the articles and listen to the podcast and do all of those things as well. It's such a support to us. It keeps us going. So we do thank you for that. And we do wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving as well. Hopefully you can sit back and kind of enjoy the day for what it is. And then the next day, there's a lot of hockey going on around that holiday. We got a Wednesday night game, Thursday or Saturday or Friday afternoon game, and Saturday night game, all jammed into one action-packed weekend, hopefully. But
even once the Flyers and Rangers wrap up on that Thanksgiving showdown, that's a 15 game slate we're talking there. So if you're a hockey fan, I can't think of a better way. If you go out get some of those Black Friday deals, you just go home and watch some of the many samplings that the National Hockey League has to offer.
And I'll chime in with this, Rob, for you too, because I know I like this. Other people, because I view this has the feel of the way a college football day would work. You got the Flyers and Rangers at 1 o'clock that day. They get the kind of isolated time with the NBC feature game, if you will. But then after that, there's 5 games that are on at 4 o'clock, a 6 o'clock start, a 7 o'clock start, a few 7:30s in there, 8 o'clock, and one at 9 o'clock. That's an all-day spectacle here where you can literally try to tap in. If you are a big hockey fan in general, then hopefully you are like Rob and I here, and you have the NHL TV app, so you don't just limit yourself to watching the Flyers sometimes and whoever they're playing. You can watch anybody at any time. Essentially, all the out-of-market games are available. And if you do that, or if you can watch those games, you can see a lot of good players and a lot of really good matchups here. Even the last game of the night, Canucks Sharks, is a pretty good matchup. I mean, that's 2 teams that have been playing well in the Western Conference. Bruins Penguins could be a good one, just because Pittsburgh's always a threat, even for where they are in the standings. Mentioned that Columbus Toronto game on the slate as well. Sabres Canadiens has potential to be a really good one as well. So, a couple really good ones on the schedule, and let's not forget too, Wednesday and Saturday are also going to be jam-packed days as well. So your weekend could be full of hockey here if you're taking a pause from the traditional Thanksgiving football and all of that good stuff, and still in recovery from all the turkey you're going to eat on Thanksgiving. So with that, let's wrap things up. That's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia Podcast. Again, we are on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Also, remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly Podcast Network. Remember, you can listen to us and shows on the rest of the Philly sports scene through the podcast network, the Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly, covering the Phillies, the Pick Swap Pod covering the Sixers, and the Kelly Green Boys covering the Eagles. So thank you for tuning in. For Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on sportstalkphilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaney.